Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we hate war and love peace. This is episode 94, and we're going to talk about racism done badly. This is a departure from my departure, right? So normally these are the kinds of episodes that I was uploading before I changed jobs. The new job teaching at a middle school is just so time consuming that I just couldn't have time to make episodes the way that I did when I first started. And so then I went to making episodes based on my sermons. But since I'm on winter break, I thought I'd make one or two episodes on topics not related to my preaching. Um, I tried to do one earlier, but I caught a really bad cold and I just could not get through the recording without uh, sneezing into the mic every couple of seconds. So here it is, a little bit delayed. But as a review of my conceptualization of race, my definition, understanding, presentation of race. A more complete version is in episode 8. It's with my old microphone, so it'll sound a little bit different. But basically, all race is a generalization based on a single characteristic. And basically, it's for this reason that it is kind of very negative in the minds of so many people. But at the same time, what people forget is that it is absolutely necessary because it's a generalization. It's a starting point for learning. It's a starting point for understanding. It gives one an orientation on how to approach a certain topic. So each racialization, to put it in another way, is unified by a characteristic. So everyone, everything that is a member of a general category, they all share the same characteristic. You see this in the animal world. What is it? Mammals are those entities which need to breathe air, right, in order to live. And that's why fish are not mammals. And whales, even though they swim in the ocean, they're mammals, right? And so you begin to realize that through generalizations, we create different kinds of categories. And through the categories, we can then understand how to approach and proceed and try to understand uh, whatever it is that we're studying. All right. So not everyone, however, or everything in the same racial category are the same. As I just illustrated, just because everything swims in the ocean doesn't mean that they are all fish. They're mammals, they're crustaceans. I think jellyfish are a different category as well, if I remember my biology correctly, but I'm probably wrong. It's been so long. But anyway, so anything can be generalized or racialized, if we were to use that word, from people to ideas, from material things to abstract things. Anything that can be generalized can also be turned into a racial category. So, for example, the Dallas Cowboys, the football team in the NFL, you could be a fan of the Dallas Cowboys, and anyone who is a fan of the Dallas Cowboys, they're fans for various reasons, different reasons. But what unifies all of them, this diverse group of human beings, is that they are fans of the Dallas Cowboys. Now, in the same way, we can, right? So you can have doctors, lawyers, you can have construction workers, unemployed people, people on welfare, people who hate welfare, etc. So you have this incredibly diverse group of people that are in the same category simply because they like the same football team. It doesn't even mean that they get along with each other. They might party together, but then when they have a deep conversation, they'll probably become enemies of each other. And this is true for every racialization. And you begin to sense and realize why there are so many problems that arise whenever you try to talk about race in a very specific, narrow kind of way. Now, some people have made the argument that ethnic groups, like in Asia, uh, that there's more uniformity there. And so it's a lot easier to talk about race in a monoracial situation. But of course, that breaks down because only people who are unfamiliar with that area, that culture, that region, that ethnic group will say asinine things like that, right? And the more that you get to know the people who live in that area, the more that you realize that if you can't use language or culture or skin color to make distinction to create racial categories, then you're going to try to do something else. Um, Dialect, hometown, ancestry. And if you don't buy this, it's either because you don't understand Asian society, but we can choose a simpler example like the Rwanda incident in Africa, right? So to a lot of Westerners, they're all black, but of course, for the people who live there, they're radically different from each other, and that's because of their tribal affiliation. And we could do this all day, but I think I made the point that depending on how you want to divide people up, how you're going to create racial categories, you're just simply creating a starting point. It is not the end point. It's not you solved something and you've come to a deeper revelation. No, it's just basically for people who know, you're advertising just how superficial your research, your scholarship actually is. Okay. And yes, I know when I say stuff like this, I sound very, very arrogant. But if you know what I'm trying to say and you understand what I'm trying to say, I'm actually trying to make the case for my own personal ignorance. There's just too much to know. But what I do know is that there's too much to know. And so to make any kind of claim of having knowledge of the truth is just completely absurd. And so if you're not even to that point of understanding the absurdity of making such a claim, then you really are in the dark, right? It's worse than being in Plato's cave looking at shadows on the wall. You're blindfolded in the cave, so you can't even see the shadows on the wall. Okay. Excuse me. So I mentioned the concept of fuzzy logic back in episode 8, where concepts can be right and wrong at the same time. It's not a big deal. It happens all the time. And so generalizations, they're kind of a little bit true, probably with one detail, but everything else is not really true. And so that's what the problem is. It's just a really bad way of understanding people through narrow racialization. So in other words, race, the concept, the construct, it's constructed, it's made up, but it's trying to describe and explain what is perceived by people. So you can't just reason it away, right? And what makes it extremely bad is that people use racial categories or generalizations to write legislation, to write laws on how things should be. Like, this is bad, you should do this instead. But of course, there's so many other people who are not thought of, right? Which gives rise to unintended consequences. In other words, because there is immense diversity within any given racialization, you may target a certain subgroup within a certain racialization, but now you implicate so many other people. And given the nature of legislation, you cannot address all of those other exceptions to the definition that you are using to create that legislation. And so it's subject to abuse. Later on, you're going to have charges and claims of institutional racism, etc. So it's good and it's bad. Like I said, there's a more detailed analysis is in episode 8, but I do want to say that racializations, because of the way they're used, they're bad and they're good. Focusing, and I'm pretty sure people understand how bad it is. But the good is that, oh, we don't have to really do anything. So there's a bad racialization, right? I don't know, let's call it trying to be delicate here because my arbitration date is not yet definite. It's just only in March at some time, but um uh Cleveland Brown fans. Okay, let's just do that. Let's be safe. And you can substitute Cleveland Browns with pretty much anything you want that people are discussing authoritatively these days. But let's just go with something safe, the Cleveland Browns, which is, I don't really follow football all that much anymore. But when I did, Cleveland Browns always seem to be at the bottom of the league, probably because the upper management doesn't want to spend a lot of money on the team, etc. So, sure, Cleveland Browns, they're awful, but uh, there's no crime in supporting the Browns. There's no crime in buying a ticket to go see the game. Probably it's a crime if taxpayer money is used to subsidize the team, but I have a feeling that that's partly why they're not so good is because they don't receive subsidies. I could be wrong. But you see the thing, right? So there's no crime in advocating it. It's just that you just have a bad team. And so there are very few Cleveland Brown fans, especially when they're having a losing season. And that's what we want, right? So the great thing about racializations is that people are free to embrace them or to reject them. And you let people do whatever it is that they want. But to legislate a solution using a narrow understanding of the Cleveland Browns will never be the solution, right? You will never make everyone happy. There will always be a minority of people who are extremely unpleased by the proposed solution. And I know everyone is pushing democracy and saying how great it is, but as I remind everyone, as I used to remind everyone in my classes, democracy means oppression of the minority. And what's so funny about a lot of this woke stuff that we're seeing today is that it had its origins in the defense and championing of the minority. But now apparently we can do both, right? Have the minority dictate what's up with democracy, which is just all very, very silly. But anyway, so legislation is never or rarely, I'll just say rarely, in case there is some kind of redeemable solution, but rarely does it ever happen. This is important to note because life is just simply getting more and more complex, right? Interracial relationships, when that started happening a lot more, I mean, a lot more in the 70s and 80s, then racial color categories, color racial categories started falling apart. And so people started coming up with more colors. But that wasn't the solution, right? So they're trying to reform the original way of thinking by just simply adding on to a bad uh, way of understanding people. So it's kind of like throwing good money after bad. You're going to double down on a bad idea. You should just give it up and move on, try to find something that would work better. I talked about intersectionality. Uh, Kind of an attempt, but falls very short. And I talk about that in episode 38. We have to also remember that whenever we talk about race, we're really talking about identity, the identity of other people, of ourself, but also the identity of ideas. Are these ideas really evil ideas, fascist ideas, sinful ideas, or are they somehow good and bad, So those people who see the positive use of certain things, then okay, do something with it, take responsibility for whatever it is that you're going to do. And those people who think that it's bad, well, stay away, but leave other people alone. Uranium might be a good example here. It's toxic, it's dangerous, you handle it, you die. But other people who figure out a use for it, well, then let them have at it, right? And if they die, like I know someone who, my father knew someone who worked with nuclear waste and he died of cancer. And it was probably because, in spite of all the safety protocols, he probably unintentionally was exposed to too much radioactivity. Anyway, So, you make your choices and you live with your choices. But it's identity. And just to go over identity again, what our personal identity is, it's the sum total of all the racial categories that we can be put into. In other words, all of the adjectives in the past that we have long forgotten, we've grown out of, that contributed to shaping our personality, our character, the way we see the world, the way people see us, whether we like them or we don't. It has an impact on us. And also, as we move into the future, there are going to be future categories that we can be put in. For example, blogger, that never existed when I was a kid. And a lot of people became bloggers, right? So our identities are constantly um, getting more complicated, shall we say. And that's a good thing, right? Because it prevents people from pigeonholing us. This is how we can circumvent discrimination. This is how we can overcome discrimination. And we need to have a more free society in order to be able to explore all of the potential racializations that we could inhabit. Now, as we can see today, people have gone crazy with the racialization, but we have to keep in mind the cost, right? What is the trade-off by emphasizing pronouns, right? Well, in a free society, you can say, you have to use my pronouns, and I can simply say, no, right? Because we're free to do whatever it is that we want. Now, obviously, if we care about people, we love people, and they want us to use certain pronouns, you may consider doing it, right? But it's kind of absurd for people to say, this is what I think I am, so therefore, you must treat me in this way. No, that there's nothing that says that. Um, when kids want to assert themselves with their parents, they get put in their place, and depending on the family, how they are put in their place is varied, but nevertheless, it happens all the time. So, if we think about the cost of which aspect of our identity we want to emphasize, then some decisions are good, some decisions are not so good, right? So if we don't want people to look at our skin color, then we have to have something else that we can offer. Maybe superior math ability, maybe photographic memory, maybe there our speed, maybe our athleticism, maybe our creativity. I mean, whatever. So there are many aspects of identity that we can use to overcome discrimination on another aspect of our identity, right? And just don't make a big deal out of it. As long as people are not allowed to legislate morality based on a narrow understanding of race, we're cool, right? And it'll become such a minor thing uh, that when you hear people getting triggered, so-called triggered or offended because of what someone might have implied, well, most of society would just look at you as being immature. And I think it says something about the level of intelligence or level of thinking of society when people talk about getting triggered, and instead of being offended that someone is triggered or even using that terminology, people go along with it. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, I talk about honest money in episode 79 in a sermon, but in episode 79, I discuss how because we don't have honest scales or honest money, uh, it's a lot harder to see the cost of the choice that we make. That's why the universities, they get to go on and on about all of their beloved topics, and they don't feel the pinch of the cost of their choices, right? Because society is structured in such a way that it protects it. They're beginning to see the effects with the declining enrollment, but again, it's very slow. And unfortunately, also because of the education bubble that was blown up as a result of all of this money printing, um, a lot of people are now sort of caught up in and feel obligated to participate in the university bubble. All right. But once we have honest money, once we understand value and the cost of the choices that we make, then we can avoid this kind of situation, if not as a society, at least on an individual level. And at this point, I think that's all we have, because it's just astounding how in Korean we say "dune," right? How just dull and how sort of intellectually dishonest so many people are, and have absolutely no problem with it at all. All right, so I wanted to go over a couple of examples of bad racialization, bad, lazy racialization, right? And any bad racialization is going to be lazy racialization, because people just don't want to make the effort to understand better, to understand more deeply. All right, and I chose a couple of easy ones, but I tried a couple current ones, and oh, I thought of another one. But anyway, I mean, right? Because everything that can be generalized can be turned to a racial category. I am sure that in your own personal situation, you can come up with better ones than me, but I'm trying to hit a wider audience, maybe eventually. Just try to grab things off of the news. Okay. First one, Democrat, Republican. Wow, right? Everyone in the United States has to belong to one or the other, right? And so everyone extremely diverse in the society, uh, but you're going to be one or the other. And it's kind of hilarious if you think about it, how on the one hand, people don't, are trying to pump this idea that gender is fluid, but when it comes to politics, no, no, no. Politics is not fluid, right? Is very interesting. But it is a very popular way of dividing the country politically, because then, there's less information you need to control. There's less information that you need to manipulate. Um, and because everyone has been dumbed down so much, you just simply say some cliches, something that they've been socialized to already accept as being true or sacrosanct, something that is extremely valuable and moral, and you get everyone to virtue signal. Republicans do it in a different way with different topics, but generally are no different. Well, actually, the people, the voters, may be different in some way, but their politicians that they elect clearly functioning in the Demopublicans, Republicrats kind of continuum, right? There's very little difference between them. Another bad example of bad racialization is liberals, conservative, right? So it's a pair, but a lot of people, and I listened to, I think it was a Mises.org podcast where they talked about how liberalism was so successful and popular going from 1800s to the 1900s that it was co-opted by socialists, and they started calling themselves liberals, right? And so this is why a lot of anarco-capitalists, a lot of libertarians will call themselves classical liberals, right? So it's not the current understanding of liberal, it's the old way of understanding liberal. And liberal is someone who embraces and is open to change in all things, right? Better cell phones, better computers, better TVs, better jobs, better society, whatever, better tech, that's a liberal. And so most people, though, will sort of invoke liberalism within religious belief, and that was because that was the big deal. A lot of people did not like the liberalization in faith, especially when you talk about conservative religious groups. And so let's go look at conservatism. Conservatism are people who reject change, more or less. And so they try to preserve the old way. And the way that you preserve the old way of doing things is by writing lots of laws. So laws in religion are called doctrine, right? Commandments, perhaps. But in the political realm, we're going to talk about legislation, right? And so writing laws is the number one way of maintaining old traditions, preserving the past. That's why we have conservation societies, conservationists, right? These are people who try to not disturb anything, will sacrifice any kind of progress in the name of preserving what is clearly better, the old way, right? And so I bring this up, and I used to bring this up all the time as well. So, given those two definitions, who are the conservatives in Washington, D.C.? And everyone wants to say Republicans, but they know that it's problematic. And so, obviously, 99.9% of politicians in Washington, D.C. today are conservatives because they all are writing legislation, except they want legislation written their way. And so, the true liberal is no longer, well, there are only a few exceptions. Thomas Massey, Rand Paul. Ron Paul, of course, was the biggie um, in terms of being socially liberal. And you can be both at the same time, right? Because of the way racialization is, you can be politically liberal, but religiously conservative, which is kind of the way I am, extremely conservative when it comes to my belief. But because I know that I'm being extremely conservative, that the beliefs that I maintain are extremely expensive. And so I don't expect anyone else to agree with me. I simply don't. And so the liberal aspect of my existence, which is that, yeah, you can walk away. There's no obligation or coercion that is going to be employed to get you to agree with me or to live in the way that I want you to live. So liberal, conservative, right? People get those two generalizations wrong, and they're comfortable with them because of the impression, right? Is it a favorable impression, a negative impression? And people like the vibe of being correct, and so they'll adopt those labels as well. Fascist, here's another lazy label. No one, very few people bother to try to figure out what fascism is. Javier Milei is being called a fascist again these days, and clearly he's not a fascist, right? And so, for the benefit of all my listeners and anyone who I encounter in the future, I read Benito Mussolini's The Doctrine of Fascism, which he wrote in 1932, the first fascist state of the world, at least by name. And he explains what fascism is. And fascism at its core is anti-individual, right? Yeah, you're not allowed to be an individual. You're not allowed to have your own independent ideas. You have to submit to the authority of the state, and obviously not looking too much to the future, the state being himself. And anyone who is a fascist today is pro big government. And I think it's kind of interesting that a lot of people who are the fascists, like Antifa, anti-fascist, right? That's what it stands for. They are the fascists, but they call everyone else a fascist. You know, it's a pretty bold move of projectionism, which is pretty much what a lot of people do today. They project onto others what they themselves are actually doing. I don't know why and how you can do that. I mean, that is some deep hypocrisy at the very least. But how you can accuse other people of the very crime that you're committing, maybe there's a psychological problem also going on at the same time. I don't know. So now you can have bad or lazy racialization with bad knowledge, with bad information. And you're too lazy to do the research yourself to try to figure out if it is something accurate or something that needs to be rejected. Another lazy racialization is this idea of woke. My personal understanding of wokeness is wokeism is thinking like a liberal scholar, liberal in the contemporary sense, of course. So anyone who thinks like a contemporary liberal scholar is woke, right? And so that's a broad category, but it encompasses pretty much everything. So one could almost categorize me as woke too, because I use the whole postmodernist discourse, except I like to say, I claim that I'm using it the right way, deconstructing everything. So then we can get an orientation on how to approach and understand things. Anyway, so the problem with wokeism, however, is that there are huge numbers of people who have been socialized to think badly, to racialize badly. They just want to be told what the right answer is. So when the test comes, they can just put the right answer is. If someone asks them a question, they'll have the right answer, you know. So they just want to do the right thing. But what's interesting is that they do this to not repeat the mistakes of the past, but the very way that they're going about it is a repetition of the past. Um, One example is the post-Vietnam guilt. Like there were so many movies that were made to basically guilt trip everyone in America about how veterans were treated after coming back from the Vietnam War. And so a campaign, I remember there being this huge sort of trend where you want to praise now all of the veterans. And so you see people going up to others saying, thank you for your service and things of that nature. But it generally tends to be very negative, right? So wokeism in general just tends to be negative, right? You're criticizing not constructively, but you're criticizing to damn people, right? To squash people, to oppress other people. And it provides you a legitimate, so-called academically legitimate way of escaping your own guilt, right? So wokeism, very extremely lazy, narrow subjectivity passed off as being true, and then telling all your students that this is the right answer, and because they're pretty dull to begin with, and yeah, I was one of them too. So that's why I'm using this harsh language because I'm very critical of my younger self. And they never bothered to check it, right? They trusted certain people, they were betrayed by those people, and you know, eventually you find yourself in a very deep, dark hole. Okay, some of the more contemporary one, Palestinian. Okay, we're going to talk about Palestinians, right? Not Palestinian children, no. Not people who are living in Gaza Strip who are Christian. Oh no. Not talking about the women. I was listening to Judge Knapp, Judge Napolitano, and he had there was a statistic that was raised there where at this point, December 29th, 20,000 people have been killed in Gaza, and 14,000 of them are women and children, non-combatants, right? Oh, wonderful. This is great. But we don't talk about that because we don't talk about children. We talk about Palestinians, right? We talk about Jews or Israelis, but we don't, want to look too deeply past the initial generalization of Palestinian. So there's that aspect of it. But then this proposed solution is to take in refugees into your home. Look, the day that Nancy Pelosi starts and what's his face, uh, Lindsey Graham starts taking in refugees and illegal immigrants into their house, when they start doing that, maybe I'll consider it a little bit more before I reject the idea. But they're not even doing it, so why should anyone do that? Israeli. Okay, this is where we get to invoke that cliche, love the country, hate the government, right? I mean, Israeli, what does it even mean? Someone who lives there? And if it's someone who lives there, then it can't possibly be Jews here in America, no matter what they say. They're not Israelis. I had this conversation back in fifth grade. I remember uh, someone, I won't say her name, but I called her Israeli because that's what it made sense to me. And she's basically said, I'm not Israeli, I'm Jewish. And I'm like, oh, huh. And it gave me information to turn over in my head. Maybe she thought I was just being obnoxious, but I thought I was being polite. But anyway, so not everyone who lives there goes along with their government, obviously. Not everyone agrees with the policies. Um, and what do the people here have to do with the people over there? I mean, if you're so moved to fight, then you can go and fight over there if you want. No one's stopping you. And I've listened to commentary not just by libertarian-minded anarco-capitalists here in the United States, but also Israelis as well. They don't want U.S. help. And I think that getting the United States out of this situation will bring about a speedy conclusion, right? Either the Israelis will run out of ammunition and money, um, and so they have to figure out a way to uh, live peaceably with all of its neighbors, and including finding a solution for the situation in Gaza. That at the very least, the killing should come to an end sooner. Also, it would force Israel to have to figure out how to get along better with a lot of the Arab nations there, which it was doing, I realized, or I heard they were making trade deals with other countries. But this whole conflict has pretty much put a kibosh on that. And I don't understand why they don't consider the future ramification, future consequences of the actions they're taking today. Like, who in their right mind would, negotiate and trade with a country like Israel, given the publicity surrounding a lot of the things that they're doing? CEOs. What's a CEO? Oh, they're those greedy people in charge of corporations. Uh, I'm pretty sure I mentioned this before, but sometimes my students will ask me, do I like corporations? How do I feel about corporations? And I'm like, they're good, right? Because churches are corporations too. I mean, pretty much every business now has to be incorporated because of the legal structure that is here in the United States. And so, technically speaking, I am a CEO, but you don't see me rolling in money. No, it's a CEO of a church. I mean, especially a small church, that means basically a lot of sacrifice, not uh, public displays of wealth, like that Osteen guy. No, it's a lot of sacrifice. It's a lot of um saving and trying to reduce cost and cheaper alternatives. I mean, that's basically right. So to put all CEOs into the same categories, and then people could say, "Oh, I meant rich CEOs." Yeah, same conversation. We can talk about the poor, but poor compared to what, right? Isn't that what Thomas Sowell would always say? Uh, I'm poor. Well, compared to what? Right? What was the joke that he would always say? People ask him, "Oh, how's your wife?" And he would say, "Compared to whom?" So what someone's state is changes when what you're comparing it with is manipulated, right? So the poor in this country is hardly poor when you think about other countries, right? And given the racialization, how you racialize, you're going to incentivize certain kinds of knowledge production. You're going to write legislation based on certain stereotypes. But uh, is that really who we're talking about? Is it really going to help the people that you're imagining? Or is it just simply a straw man argument, right? Like, oh, we have to help the poor. None of those people actually exist except in the minds of people who are writing that legislation. And once the legislation passes, you can see people trying to change their identity to fit into that category so they can participate in the government largesse, right? Getting their piece of the pie, as it were. We can talk about disabled people, right? The American Disabilities Act, and how that probably, most likely, led to this sort of disability craze that we see today. Like everyone's disabled now because there's so many benefits, right? So why not try to be labeled as disabled because you are going to get some kind of benefit as a result, right? So bad racializations, lazy racializations, they create perverse incentives. They also have perverse consequences. And so writing legislation or living your life pretty much focused and centered around, um, you know, generalizations, it's just a really not a very productive way of living. So, what's the conclusion? The conclusion is freedom, right? Freedom always makes everything better, or usually will make things better. Probably should be less absolute there, but I mean, freedom is always good, really. It's just that most people's perception of freedom in a certain given moment will always can potentially be negative. But the reality is that eventually, over time, um, excuse me, freedom will allow you to have access to solutions that you need to resolve your current situation. Let people be what they want to be, right? If you want to change your gender, okay, fine. But that's your business. Don't make it mine. Don't make it my kids. Don't bring it into the school, right? In the same way that, hey, I can be a Jesus freak, but and I go to school, I can say I'm a Jesus freak, but I don't force anyone else to be, right? So you get curiosity, you get people to ask you questions based on how you represent that certain racialization. Then people come up to you and they ask you questions, or they totally ignore you because it doesn't seem to be a viable way of living life in society. So let everyone be what they want to be, say what they want to say, believe what they want to believe, but no one can force anyone else to believe, say, do anything that they don't want to, right? And so, and especially if you look at the cost, if the actual cost of the choices that people make, then people will realize that certain choices are extremely expensive. Like, I'll lose all my friends, I'll lose my family. You're still free to be able to do whatever you want. You just have to live with the consequences. And these days, it's like I'm free to make the choices that I want, and I can reject all of the consequences as well. No, you can't have that, right? But that is what's trending. No, no, no. That's not freedom. That's coercing other people to fund, to pay, to support, to agree, and then therefore criminalize those who don't. And this is the problem that we have is a disappearance of freedom. So bad racialization leads to the undermining of the concept of freedom that is so necessary to be able to overcome our everyday problems and also the greater social issues that may arise. And you can apply this to pretty much everything from climate change to racism, from oppression to you know, war, I guess. Hopefully that is a little beneficial, helps you to see the world in a different way, in a better way, perhaps. And most of all, hopefully it will help us to keep our temper, our emotions on a better keel, on an even keel, rather than having to go up and down because of the conversations that you're having or because of what other people are saying. Well, that's it for this episode. I will talk to you in the next one.